Audio analysis, versions of the sisters. Welcome to Deeper Stories with your author, Thaddeus Thomas. As I read to you the main part of my post on comparing the versions of the sisters, the 1904 version that appeared in the Irish Homestead and the 1914 version that appeared in the Dubliners. The sisters comparison. The Homestead version has been called more akin to Romanticism than the final version's modernism. My first clue is why this might be is in the first line and repeated thereafter, providence. Now let's get into some definitions here. Romanticism, a movement in the arts and literature that originated in the late 18th century, emphasizing inspiration, subjectivity, and the primacy of the individual, according to Oxford Languages. Modernism, reevaluation of the assumptions and aesthetic values of their predecessors. It evolved from the romantic rejection of Enlightenment positivism and faith in reason. Modernist writers broke with romantic pieties and cliches such as the notion of the sublime and became self-consciously skeptical of language and its claims on coherence. That's from the Poetry Foundation. In Dubliners, gone is the suggestion that the boy who provides the point of view was guided by providence and of his being a prophet for correctly guessing the priest's death. This is maybe the distinction critics make in calling the original more romantic. We find this change also in less veiled style of writing. Joyce goes from saying, "Did it reveal the ceremonious candles in whose light the Christian must take his last sleep," to writing instead, "For I knew that 2 candles must be set at the head of a corpse." The writing presents the world as it is, clearly. That doesn't mean there's no room for the symbolic, but even the symbolic becomes crisp. "Every night as I gazed up at the window, I said softly to myself the word paralysis. It had always sounded strangely in my ears, like the word gnomon in the Euclid or the word simony in the Catechism. But now it sounded to me like the name of some maleficent and sinful being. It filled me with fear, and yet I longed to be nearer to it and to look upon its deadly work." It strikes me as odd to make such a distinction between one version speaking of providence and the other of some maleficent and sinful being, but the latter is clearly a mental process and, I argue, a key for opening the symbolism of the work as a whole. It describes not the work of the supernatural, but the cruelties and the way we think about the sick and mentally ill. As a writer, this encourages me to be clear in descriptions and the setting of facts. The 1914 version is better written, I believe, and poetic, but more importantly, the details aren't lost within indirect sentences when it really matters, especially there at the beginning. I want to take a step back to compare the relative strength of these openings. 1904. 3 nights in succession, I had found myself in Great Britain Street at that hour as if by providence. The 1914. There was no hope for him this time. It was the 3rd stroke. In my reading, his revision is succinct, powerful, and clear. We know exactly where we are in the narrative, and that's ironic, as the first version tells us what street we're on, but little else. The first version is passive. The final version is blunt and sure. His original doesn't even mention death until the 2nd paragraph. Until then, he dances around the subject, repeatedly referring to the character's impending death as it. Then we're given the new material, the rumination over the word paralysis, and we have room for his pondering because the situation is as clear in our minds as it is in the text. As we move on to Old Cotter, I may contradict everything I just said, because the first version is roundabout in setting up the death, and then plain in setting up Cotter. It tells plainly Cotter's concerns, while the second gives us mystery, with Cotter's inability to articulate. That opening clarity makes this mystery of speech possible and meaningful. The first version gives us information, but none of the momentum in the revision. Cotter's speech becomes the question that propels the story forward in that rewrite. What was wrong with the priest? Why shouldn't a child be around a man such as that? The lack of answers sends us searching for closure and informs us how to view the rest of the story. This, too, is a type of clarity and simplicity. The original is indirect, while the second guides the reader. The opening paragraph for the 1914 sets the narrative and introduces us to the conflation of illness and sin. We then move into an immediate cut to his coming down to supper in the middle of Old Cotter's opinion. There's conflict in that opinion. The dialogue in the original is lifeless by comparison, but here our emotions rise to the narrator's defense while we also worry if there really was something dangerous about the priest. The offending suggestions and unanswered questions make for an engaging and meaningful interchange between the adult characters that propels the story forward. Writers often talk about the scene in the sequel. In the original, there wasn't enough conflict to warrant a sequel, a moment in the story that reflects upon what happened in the scene. Now a sequel is demanded and given when the narrator tries to sleep but is haunted by Old Cotter's words and visions of the dead priest's face. None of that existed before. We get to the drapery scene. Now, up through the reading of the posted card, there are some minor editorial changes. Only in the second paragraph do we resume with the meaningful changes. In the original, the boy is shocked to find the old man really is only 65. Joyce replaces that with more immediate and important emotions. The reality of the death sets in and the boy finds himself in check. The first version comments on the priest sitting in the room behind the shop, but this one presents us with the narrator wanting to complete this common ritual, only to find himself blocked by the reality of death. The second version narrows the action. The boy brings him the snuff, a present of his aunt, instead of the aunt bringing it herself. It keeps the relationship between the priest and the boy central. In the original, the sisters are introduced here, and we're told Nanny is almost deaf, but they're removed entirely from the scene in the revision. The details all switch to focus on the boy and the priest, the subject of the mystery set forth by Old Cotter's speech. In the next paragraph, after the omitted line about not being able to believe the priest is dead, which has now been contradicted, the boy lacks the courage to visit and walks away on the sunny side of the street, feeling like the death has freed him in some way. He chastises himself, remembering all the priest taught him, which brings us to details from the original version. Again, the specificity of the unanswered questions in the beginning give direction and focus in the narrative now. The guilty feelings of freedom are natural, but it takes on a sinister tint here, as does the priest's strange smile. These changes at the start guide the writer as well as the reader. He knows his own focus and what details stray from that focus. When we get to the wake, the visiting of the dead, there's some difference in the description that's interesting. It kind of opposes the difference at the beginning, because what started off as simple becomes a bit more complex and maybe indirect, but yet reflects on symbolism, images we were given at the beginning. Let's go into that for a moment. So in the 1904, we have, it was an oppressive summer evening of faded gold. In the 1914, we have, it was after sunset, but the window panes of the house that looked to the west reflected the tawny gold of a great bank of clouds. The change in description calls to mind the opening and looking to the windows for the candles set at the head of the corpse. Drawing the reader's mind back to a detail would be meaningless unless the detail were clear and meaningful in the first place. Details are increased here, giving Nanny more action before she fades into the background. This has become necessary as this is the sisters' first introduction, but it also keeps that information about the sisters where it's most important. I'm going to interject here, getting away from what I've written, to say in the first version, the story really was about the relationship between those sisters and the priest. And Joyce changes the focus to the boy and the priest. Before, it was about how the sisters, in their poverty, cared for his every need, especially after he got sick and could no longer perform the duties of the priesthood. And yet, it's said that basically he despises women and takes their service without even speaking to them. And it becomes a metaphor for the priesthood and the laity, and was the source of the contention over the story with its original readers. Eventually, his stories just stopped being published in that rural newspaper because this was not the kind of story, the kind of message they wanted to receive. All right, let's get back into what I'd written. Added to this, as well, is the action of the boy feeling the need to be silent. He tiptoes and rejects the crackers for fear they'd be too loud. None of these details appear in the original, and they speak to a natural instinct of respect for the dead. It also suggests he fears he may wake the dead, which carries the weight of the mystery that lies between the priest and the boy. Joyce's dialogue carries the niceties of society. When reading The Dead, for example, every real and true utterance is a shock of rudeness. Polite conversation is shallow. We have that here, but the final version chooses its polite conversation more carefully. The details of the story may be the same, but now they reflect the climax of the mystery Joyce has been building. The dialogue heightens the mystery as much as it sheds light upon it. I'll add here more because Joyce does not answer the questions he raises. Every change in the sisters harkens back to that stronger opening and the mystery set in old Cotter's speech. Joyce found that mystery within the series of events he'd already written, with the only wholly new section being the attempts to sleep and the dream. However, that change early on inspired change throughout the piece, giving new meaning and focus to the moments Joyce had previously imagined.